thing to even imagine that we're talking about in a class about drug and alcohol treatment, but why do you kind of think we have to make some sort of definition or some sort of baseline for what is recovery? I'm going to let y'all talk too, not all through Facebook. I'll let you talk with your voices.
To make it more empirical.
Okay, and tell people what that means.
To make it more of a science where it's just not like based off feelings, but like hard data.
So to make it based off data. And anything else? Anybody been around the profession, recovery, for people, just different professors teaching about it, and notice a difference in the way people talk about it? If you go to one department, maybe they're calling it chemical dependency. In another, maybe they're calling it substance abuse. In another, we're telling you use the word substance use disorder. So that's another reason that we need to make a definition, is if we're going to, as educators, as people in recovery, as people that work in the profession, going to ever do justice to reducing the stigma that is around what addiction is and what recovery is, we're going to have to get on the same page in order to have the loudest voice, in order to share with other people that aren't in rooms like this, that have an understanding of addiction and recovery. We're going to have to help people outside of these rooms by saying the same thing, by saying just the same thing. Even when we talk to our legislators, it's important that we share the same words and the same vision and the same ideas, because a voice that says the same thing speaks louder. Does that make sense? Okay. And if anybody does put a question on Facebook, will you kind of give us a nod or something? Carrie's going to monitor it so she can ask me. But please feel free, like any other day in here, just to ask the questions as we go along. I don't want this to impede that ability. Okay, so Module 1 is all about recovery. I don't know why it says it starts on page 17, because it certainly doesn't. But the things that I felt like were important to convey in this module were what SAMHSA defined recovery as. And I remember getting an email one day from SAMHSA and NADAC, and they asked us to say what we thought recovery was, to define what we thought recovery was. And from that, they developed a definition of recovery. And the importance of that in practice is that if we're clinicians, if we're working in the field of recovery, in the field of addiction, we need to have a real good idea what recovery is, because one of the things SAMHSA and NADAC found through some of their surveys and research was that people had different ideas. And so if you talk to one counselor, you'd get one idea, and if you talk to another counselor, you'd get another idea. And as counselors, we're measuring a person's success in different ways. And so it was important for them to make some sort of national definition for what recovery was as far as in practice. And there are a lot of reasons that it is a challenge to develop one definition for recovery. One is that there's no authority on it. There's no authority designated to say this is what recovery is defined as. Like there's the DSM that says this is what the diagnosis is. There's not an authority to say what recovery is. Another is that if you are a person in recovery, it really appears that the way you recover influences the way you define recovery for other people. So maybe if you are recovering and you take a certain pathway to your recovery, maybe not even meaning to, when you're being clinical with your clients, you're gauging whether or not they're successful on their journey based on what you would have done in that scenario, or how you did it in that scenario, or how many times you did this thing versus this thing. And we know that can't be, that's not really valid, because humans are so different. And our journeys are always going to be different, right? And the other is that, of course, a definition like that is subjective, and it really has a lot of personal experience in it. And one of the most controversial things that we talk about when we talk about recovery today is whether or not abstinence is a must for a person to say that they are in recovery. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and ask you guys what you think about that. For a person to say that they are in recovery, must they be abstinent, continuous and uninterrupted abstinence from all substances that are mood or mind altering? And be honest with what you think.
And depends on the person and how severe their substance use disorder became by the time they were in recovery.
Are you asking that as a question, or are you making that as your statement?
I'm making that as my
Okay, so her statement is, doesn't that depend on the person? Doesn't that depend on the person and where they were when they got to the place of wanting to be in recovery and where they are at that time?
Well, it's not only the severity of their substance use disorder, it's also like if someone who is addicted to a stimulant and then they move to Adderall to manage that, is that still recovery? And I think so, but some people need that abstinence for their own recovery.
That's a very good, valid point. You know, if someone has a methamphetamine addiction, they go to treatment, and then they discover then, or maybe before, that they have a diagnosis that needs a doctor-prescribed stimulant, and they take it. Can they still consider themselves a person in recovery? I think those are very valid questions. How about if we go, someone is using opiates, someone's using heroin, and they go to what is historically known as a methadone clinic, and they're on Suboxone, or they're on methadone, or they're on another form of an opiate medication-assisted treatment or medication-assisted recovery. Can they consider themselves a person in recovery? Sure. Anybody that adamant about absolutely not? That's willing to say? Okay, talk about that.
I'm not saying absolutely not, but I would say that that would be dependent on the person and the doctor, that there would be a plan in place to have a set amount of time for that drug to be taken, and when are we going to taper off, and you know, what are we going to do going forward? Because if I'm trying to quit doing drugs, then that should be that would be my end goal. So
That would be your end goal, or would that be your end goal as a clinician for your client?
I mean, there's definitely personal choice involved here,
Okay.
and everyone is entitled to that.
Absolutely.
It would be hard for me not to say that my recommendation would be that you get with your physician and you come up with a plan to get to as low a level as possible.
And that is a very, very common answer. That is a very common answer that I hear. Is that still based on personal opinion? Subjective a little? Yeah, absolutely, it is. Does that mean your idea of recovery is abstinence?
Yes.
Okay.
It includes that.
Okay. Who else?
So I don't like the idea of saying that if you're using, you can't be in recovery. Well, for two reasons. One is, even though it's just semantics at some point, I think psychologically, like if you do use and you can still consider yourself in recovery, you don't have that mentality of, oh, well, I'm not in recovery anymore, so I might as well just keep using.
Right.
Secondly, I think there's some psychological stress involved with that label. So for instance, if you do use and then you're no longer in recovery, there's that psychological stress of, oh, now I have to start all over again.
Right.
So I think just from that standpoint, I think yes, relapsing is kind of part of that journey. Of the recovery journey.
It certainly can be. And I've shared with some of you guys, if you've ever been in my classes, part of my soapbox probably has a lot to do with language. And I'm a proponent of not even calling it relapse because of the stigma that's attached to that if you relapse, it's all done. Nothing. You don't have anything anymore. You have to go back to square one. And I don't believe that's true. And the recovery movement, for about the last 10 or 20 years, people have been trying to get people in recovery to come out and talk about recovery instead of being anonymous about it. That's what the movie Anonymous People was kind of about, is there's no way we can educate the public about what recovery looks like if we're not willing to say we're in recovery. That they have changed the language on that to say, if you have been in recovery, then you have experience. And that experience is a valuable piece of real estate. It's kind of like money in the bank, and they call it recovery capital. That you have 10, 15 years, 7 months, 6 weeks of recovery, so you have something. You have got something valuable there. And maybe in certain places you have to go back. Maybe in a 12-step meeting you have to go back and pick up a chip if you're working with a sponsor and that's what their instruction is for you. That doesn't mean you don't have the experience of that recovery, and you don't have everything thrown, we don't have to start at ground zero again for people. I think that's important.
What kind of language would you suggest in a contrast to just saying relapse?
Okay, so when I do what is historically known as relapse planning with a client, I call it recovery planning. And that may just be a little tweak on the language, because it really is looking at all the same things. And instead of calling it triggers, I call it red flags or yellow flags. Just where do you need caution? And I look at all the major life areas. Where do you already know you're going to have some issues? Where do you already know while you're in treatment you need to work on? You need to put plans in place. You need to put boundaries around. You need to work through some things in order to have the best recovery possible. And if there is use, I call it, and there's a former UNT student who's done some research, and hopefully it'll be coming out soon, that validates this. That makes me happy. That instead of calling it relapse, maybe we could refer to it as a recurrence of use. Because that's what it is. Relapse, I don't know if we did it or if it's just the word, but there's so much ugly stigma behind that word. So that's my thoughts. Those are my thoughts, is that it's just a little tweak on the word. It's just turning it into a more positive direction. When I talk to clients about recovery planning, what I say to them is recovery planning to reduce the likelihood of recurrence of use, or to reduce the consequences of a recurrence of use. So they will go back to their support system. They will go back to professionals. They will go back and get right back into services, back into their support, back into their mutual aid programs, instead of that lapse of time of shame where it can get out of control again, and people can, their addiction can become out of control again. They can die. There's just so much that can happen in that time that it's important, I think, for them to have a plan of action where it isn't shame-based, where there's not so much stigma around it to go return to services. Now here's people ask me things like, so are you saying you want people in 12-step groups to change how they identify themselves? No, I don't. It doesn't matter to me how a person who's in recovery identifies themselves. It doesn't matter to me how a client identifies themselves. What matters to me is the language I use, because the language I use has some sort of influence, and I want my influence to be positive rather than negative, and I don't want it to be neutral either. So I prefer to look at it in a way that's without shame, and it seems like those words seem to help in that way. Maybe we'll get so used to those words we'll create the stigma around those words either, but hopefully that's not the case today. Any other thoughts or questions about, can you consider yourself to be in recovery if you're not totally abstinent? Here's my thought. I've worked with clients for a long time, and my idea was it had to be total abstinence. I'll admit that. I know I've admitted a lot of things to you guys that I've done, that I've changed my way of thinking about. But I would think that it's total abstinence for the rest of your life, forever and ever, amen. And and you need to be attending this many meetings a week, or you need to be doing whatever. And when I started working in harm reduction with HIV, I saw what harm reduction was, that behaviors aren't necessarily going to change, but you can do some things to reduce the risk. And so, by doing that, a person can take part in services, and they can come back to the services without the fear of having to have that shame of, I've done something so horribly. And it seems that people like the idea of being able to make up their own mind and take their own journey rather than being given a prescription or an ultimatum of it has to be this way or else. I don't respond real well, and I don't think you guys respond real well to it's got to be this way or else. Anybody love that? Okay. Yeah. So there's a little history about recovery that is in recovery and addiction that's in the second module that I talk about here. That's just all the way back to the 1700s, all the way back to ever. I think that in some books it says cavemen, discovered alcohol because they left some fruit out and it fermented and they drank it and it felt good, and that we have had addiction and addiction issues as far back as we have been. So of course there have been people who have attempted to deal with addiction and treat addiction that far back as well. Here are some of the people who've attempted in history to put a definition to recovery. The Betty Ford Institute, on a panel, on a discussion in 2007, came up with a definition, and it was that recovery from substance dependence is voluntarily maintained lifestyle characterized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. So sobriety was part of that definition. And we go on down, even in the UK they have one here, and it is again about sustaining recovery without use, with abstinence. And you go on down, and actually even SAMHSA had previous definitions of recovery until they came to this consensus through that survey and all the conversations they had during recovery to practice. And that was that the new definition is recovery is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a life that's self-directed, strive to reach their full potential in context of health, home, purpose, and community. That's pretty simple, isn't it? And the recovery movement says that you're in recovery if you say you're in recovery, which is pretty well sums up that idea, that it isn't about abstinence. And here's kind of a something that makes sense to me, kind of a plain and simple way it makes sense to me is, have you ever met somebody who said they hadn't had a drink in 25 years and they aren't real healthy? They're kind of hard to be around. They hadn't changed anything except they hadn't had a drink in 25 years. So do we want that to be the model for recovery, or do we want it to be this, where people are changing their lives and they're going in the direction of health for all of their life, I think recovery is different than abstinence. So even if abstinence is part of recovery, I don't think it has to be the main thing. Because what happens after you have abstinence down? Once that kind of, you got it. Are you changing, and are you doing better? Are things improving in your life? Do the people that live around you, sit around you, work around you, like you? Can they tolerate you? Or are you hard to deal with? Are there any questions on Facebook yet? No? Okay, come on, y'all. Here's some of that. In the rehabilitation studies program, we talk a lot about person-first language, person-centered language, rather than calling a person by a diagnosis, changing it and calling it, making them the person first. So one of the things we've seen in our history is people have called people with people that with substance use disorder, like drunkard, inebriate, alcoholic, junkie, dependent, and those are pretty derogatory terms. And so that's the reason we changed it to, if you hear people in the recovery movement introducing themselves, they will no longer introduce themselves as, hey, my name's Joe, I'm an addict. Instead, they say, my name's Joe and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And many times they'll even add the caveat of, and what that means to me is, and they'll explain what their recovery is. I haven't had a depressive episode since, or I haven't had a drink since, or whatever their definition for their own recovery is. I like that. I like the idea that I'm a human being before anything else. I think that that's kind of cool.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So when we're discussing substance use and mental health,
Mm-hmm.
usually the two go hand in hand together. So if somebody has substance use disorder, they have some sort of mental health issue. So
That's called co-occurring disorder.
Yes, co-occurring disorder. So why the shift from dual diagnosis to co-occurring disorder?
I don't know if I know the answer to that specifically. Honestly, does anyone have that answer? Co-occurring disorder from dual diagnosis?
Well, dual suggests two, and it could be much more than two.
It could, that's true. Dual suggests two only. I think just, I don't know, you know, that's a really good question, and I'm going to find you an answer to that.
I think also, when you say dual diagnosis, a lot of times they have, they used to decide, okay, this is primary, we're gonna treat this first, and then we're gonna treat the other one.
Mm-hmm.
Where they found more recently that it's more, it works better to treat both at the same time,
Yeah.
rather than try and fix one and then fix the other one.
That makes sense. So it's
So it's
co-occurring,
co-occurring,
it's
so you're
happening
doing
at
it
the same time.
Right.
I like that. I can dig all of those ideas. I'll see if I can find a definitive, like what NADAC says or what SAMHSA says about that, but I think those are really reasonable ideas around that. I don't know why. Also, co-occurring sounds more clinical to me than it does dual diagnosis. I'm not sure the reason. I just created some circumstances here where why maybe us being on the same page with what we tell people who are seeking information could be helpful. And I created a number of scenarios here. So there's a mom who has a son who has substance use disorder, or they're using substances, even though he's promised a lot of times that he wouldn't do that. And you know that that's kind of a key there, that if you continue to have consequences and you continue to use anyway, there's probably a red flag there that maybe something's going on related to substance use disorder. So mom has a bunch of conversations with other people about what should I do. She's just seeking help. So she talks to the neighbor. The neighbor tells her, you know, I know what you mean. You know, my great uncle was hooked on crack in 1994. And he had to really hit bottom. I hear people say that a lot. He has to just really hit bottom. I mean, we had to pull the rug out from under him. The whole family kicked him to the curb and told him we wouldn't let him ever come home, give him money, or even talk to him if he wouldn't get some help. And so that's what we had to do for a while. That's what you have to do for a while when someone's a drug addict. I also put the words that we hear people say in italics there. And he ended up being homeless for a while. Then he went to prison before he got real serious. And it had to be done. Tough love. That's what you've got to practice on all addicts. Y'all heard that, haven't you? Mm-hmm. Tough love. Now, tough love was a big thing back in the 90s. If your kid won't behave, kick them out. If you're, cut them off. One of the things we're seeing now is if everyone that person loves turns their back on them, who are they going to have to get clean for? Because a person that's struggling with addiction can't always do it just for themselves. So maybe we need to take a look at the idea of tough love. I hear a lot of people who talk about enabling and say, you don't have to be mean, you don't have to kick them out, but maybe if you're going to help them, take them to dinner if they're hungry, rather than give them $100. There's all kinds of tools around that, and there are a lot of support groups that can help with ideas there. That's just one of the scenarios, okay? So mom has a best friend. I should probably name this mom so we can have a really good scenarios here. Candace? Candace?
Can I read this one?
Please! Can you read it from there?
Yeah, I can read it.
You've got good eyesight.
So best friend to Candace. that boy just needs Jesus. He doesn't even go to church with you anymore. He out running around and making bad decisions. No doctor can cure him. Only Jesus can do that. You keep praying and your prayers will be answered. You know, I read once that God hears the prayers of mothers all over. See, I got ahead of myself. I read once that God hears the prayers of mothers all over all others. You keep praying and you keep telling him how much God wants them to stop. Jesus is what you have to do to get him to stop acting up.
And we hear that, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Many people with addiction have family members that say you're just not praying hard enough, you're not praying enough, you're not going to church enough. We know that spirituality is a component in most people's recovery, but will that alone be the answer? So what if Candace listens to the neighbor or to the best friend? So Candace calls up a treatment center, and the treatment center says chemical dependency is a disease. So what your son needs is treatment for his chemical dependency, just like a person with diabetes. He needs to come in to my treatment center where there's a 90-day program, and we'll help him change his life. He has a chronic condition, and his willpower alone is not enough to stop. And your support's going to be important to him while he's here. Treatment is what he needs. So she gets another opinion.
I do have a question.
Okay, let me hear it.
If you don't have to be abstinent from substances to be in recovery, then how do you explain the progression and remission of their disease? Also, how do you explain the solution or process of recovery to them?
So if you don't have to be abstinent, how do you explain the progression of their disease? Did they say disease?
Progression and remission of their disease.
Not everybody believes that that addiction is a disease. Some people believe that it's a brain disorder. So that is one avenue. A medical model treatment will talk about addiction as a disease, but not everybody sees it that way. Not everyone sees it as a chronic, progressive, with the same outcome if they continue. And that's one thing. How do I explain it to the client?
How do you explain the solution or process of recovery if it's not to be abstinent, and how are you going to step them through that recovery?
I'm going to go out on a limb and just give a Paula answer real quick. I don't tell somebody, and I don't give advice to clients. I think a clinician is supposed to help the clients find their own solutions. So I don't think what I'm supposed to do is just sit down in a chair and go, let me tell you, Joel, what recovery is supposed to look like. When they are talking, if they're saying things that sound dangerous, I will say to them, can I give you some feedback? Joel, what I'm hearing you saying is this compared to what you're saying that you want. So tell me what's going on there. That's what I think the difference is in being a clinician, is that we actually do counseling with clients. That we're not just their buddies and say, if you want to be in recovery, this is what it's got to look like. And come back and show me that you've done all those things, and I'll check the mark for you and you've passed.
Can I add something? Just
Please,
as a graduate student and you folks hoping to get into grad school in the rehab counseling program, it's actually considered unethical to dictate goals of counseling to a client. It's something you definitely would not want to do. So I think maybe the person who asked that question is thinking of something other than counseling, maybe something more medical, like a psychiatrist, or I don't know. Maybe, or even more along the lines of peer support. Because many times in peer support or like a sponsor in a 12-step program, they may be more like, this is how I did it, and this is, you ought to try it this way, which is exactly what 12-step programs are supposed to do. That's exactly what they're supposed to be. Sponsors are supposed to do that. And so I'm certainly not saying change that relationship and make it a different one. I'm just talking about how as clinicians we can incorporate these things into being clinical in practice. Because of this, I mean, have you ever, I don't know, maybe you have, but not many people are successful being dictated to and having a positive end, If somebody came in here today and said, here, this is your new diet plan, buy everything on this list and eat it, some of us would
be a little apprehensive about that. Like, who are you to tell me? And that kind of apprehension isn't going to have as positive as results as to sit down with someone and say, what do you want the outcome to be? What are you willing to do to get that? How can I help in this process? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't offer resources, that we don't offer questions, that we don't ask and we don't share and we don't provide feedback, or that's something I always feel like I have to make sure people understand. I don't just go, okay, whatever. Oh, sure, whatever. That's not what I mean by that. I'm just much more therapeutic in the way that I approach those situations, the way I ask those questions, rather than you must do it this way. I say, have you thought about, what are you thinking about? Talk to me about this part. I'm kind of hearing, I'm not sure if this matches your goal. Tell me, because this is kind of what I'm seeing. Am I okay with that? Am I on the right page with that? Instead of just, you must do it this way. This is your prescription. Even if you work in a treatment center and it's licensed in the state of Texas, the state of Texas tells us the client must be involved in their treatment planning. We don't just write them something and hand it to them like our dentist does. And our dentist will print us out one and say, this is the biggest issue and you need to address it first. And it's always the most expensive issue, isn't it? That's not what treatment planning in treatment centers is. We do it with the client. We hear what they want.
And even outside the state of Texas, like it's a law, you involve the client within that. I would hope that like outside of Texas, just in general, that any treatment center would have that.
I would hope so. I'm a member of a page that talks about ethical issues, but it's not in this state. I've recently discovered, someone pointed me in that direction, and I went and became a member of it, and I realized after a while it was not in Texas, it was another state. And I don't know if all states have those. I really don't know, because the way some people talk on there is like they're very foreign ideas that clients are supposed to be part of their treatment. That we don't just dictate the treatment. Tell me how much more time we have. Half an hour? Okay, good, we got time. So Candace, I'm gonna have to write that name down so I don't forget it. Talks to somebody that goes to a 12-step meeting. Well, of course, if that's your way of recovery, your idea is, let me bring him to a meeting with me. Let this work for him because that worked for me. And then Candace goes to a blog. A blog you can actually click on because it's real, that belongs to a man who believes that there is no evidence that addiction is a disease or even a brain disorder, that if a person wants to change bad enough, they can. They don't need the 12 steps. They don't need treatment. They just need to change their behavior, and it is by getting education and analyzing the impact of the use on them, and they can stop. I emailed this fellow and asked him, may I use your blog as a reference? I told him you're not a popular idea, but I am absolutely open to whatever works for a person. That it's not my job to convince somebody of my way of thinking. If they want to get into recovery, then I'm going to let them get into recovery in the way that makes best sense for them. And so a person in this situation, maybe something like SMART recovery that is very rational and irrational, it's based on cognitive, so maybe an intellectual person that just doesn't want to see this and doesn't see this as a disease or a brain disorder, they probably would fit in a different category. So, not a different category, but their path to recovery would be different than a person that would see it as a brain disorder or a disease. Does that make sense a little? Any other questions? We only have one? Okay, that's my hint to y'all.
I feel like you'd have to be pretty uneducated to have that belief that the guy who was in the blog, if you study the brain at all, even though at a neurological level, you'd understand it's not true.
This is my guess. My guess is people that are really adamant about it not being a disease, maybe they went through something themselves, and it wasn't what often helps people change, that made them change, caused them to change, and they are just adamant about wanting to spread that message. I wonder if people who have that feeling were like forced into treatment as adolescents for some reason and have some strong need to share that ain't the way to go, you know. And hey, if those folks, their lives are changed and they're living a better life, then good, then great. One of the things that you'll find probably when we get to many pathways, I'll mention in here that SAMHSA in 2016, no, not SAMHSA, the Surgeon General, in 2016 released the very first Surgeon General's report ever on addiction. And one of the things they said was, this is my language, I'm sure a medical doctor didn't say it the way I'm about to, but we have to be careful about some things because adolescents who are forced into treatment who never had an addiction to begin with, they just had some issue and their parents threw them in there. Are they supposed to spend the rest of their lives defining themselves as addicted? And, you know, we've misdiagnosed people sometimes, and so maybe that's where that kind of thing comes out of. You can probably go on that blog and to the person's website and get some information about how he arrived at his ideas. And if it works for him, then that's fantastic. More questions?
Someone did just comment, recovery comes in many forms, and then another person said any recovery plan should be client-centered. That is the only way to work with them. Recovery is not one size fits all. Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll talk on next Tuesday about many pathways to recovery, and many pathways to recovery and medication-assisted recovery are the two most controversial topics we have in our whole recovery to practice, because people do have some really personal feelings about those two. Many times when I talk about many pathways to recovery, people think I'm anti-something. If I'm saying that there are many pathways, they think I'm saying, but the one you're taking is not the one. And that's not it at all. So the current SAMHSA definition of recovery is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. So in 2011, that was the most recently agreed on by SAMHSA. For recovery to practice, they came up with 4 dimensions that support recovery, and that is health, that a person physically gets better, gets their physical health, their mental health better, get on a better pathway, that they have a home, a stable place to live. There's controversy with homelessness about, if you want to get out of being homeless and get into housing, you first have to be clean. You have to be in recovery first. And this is saying maybe a living environment is the more important thing before a person can become stable to find recovery. That's not all this is saying, but that's kind of a piece of this. And purpose, they have to have something to live for. They have to have meaning in their lives. They have to have something that they want. They have to have things that are important to them in the future. And they have to have a community. And a community is a number of things. It's different for everybody. But that's part of the reason we have to educate everybody. We have to educate the community about what recovery is, about what people coming out of treatment, that they don't pose a threat. I think I've told this class before that I do a lot of legislative advocacy, and that every 2 years there's a fellow, I think around the Houston area, that puts a bill in place to require any place that houses addicts, so a treatment center, a sober living facility, be required to put some monstrous sign up in their, in front of their facility, basically warning them of the dangerous people who live there. Because society doesn't understand sometimes what recovery is, what addiction is, and that they're probably living among many, many people in recovery who just haven't felt comfortable enough to tell them yet because of their attitude toward that. And then there are 10 guiding principles.
probably this is where we'll end today. And since I said that, I'm sure I have to stick to that, right?
I just want to talk about you're talking about home and community. When the Collegiate Recovery Program here took students to Seattle, there is a large homeless population in Seattle. A large portion of the homeless people in Seattle use some type of drug, whether it be cocaine, meth, just whatever they use it. And they, in some parts of Seattle, they do provide housing for the homeless people. But what they realize in Seattle is that providing a home for somebody isn't necessarily just gonna boom, fix a problem right there.
Right.
Because a larger part is, personally, I believe, is community. If somebody having a good sense of community, whether it's bad for that person, whether it's good for that person, it's on an individual basis. But just providing a home for somebody isn't going to automatically solve some problems, because what we talked about with locals and law enforcement and lawyers and stuff like that in Seattle is that they'll provide a home for somebody, and then maybe 2 weeks later that person will be right back out on the street doing exactly what they're doing because they miss that sense of community.
Right.
So I think it's just helping that person establish a better sense of community than what they currently have.
I think that's an excellent point. In many places, practice things that Denton is actually has somebody in the area that is interested in doing this, but providing things like sobering centers rather than arresting people and taking them to jail for public intoxication or, as long as it hasn't hurt another person, a DWI is still going to have consequences. But public intoxication and some of the other things that the police often give if you're intoxicated, causing trouble or just waddling down the road, I'm not sure. But a sobering center would be a place that the person could come and not get legal consequences that's going to impact a career they have or their future careers that they might have, and we'll do an assessment to see if it's more than just being intoxicated then or if there's a wider problem there and give them resources. Houston has one, and there are also like places that people have in some communities where people go and get clean needles. That's kind of a different subject, but it is still kind of within the harm reduction idea. But community is huge, and in this curriculum there is a module on ROSC, which stands for Recovery Oriented Systems of Practice. Recovery Oriented System, what's the word?
Recovery Oriented
Systems of Care. Okay. And basically it says that you have to have community. You have to have communities that welcome people in that are wanting to be in recovery, and it's a network, and that peer support comes into play there. One of the things, I know I'm jumping around, but one of the things the Surgeon General's report told us was that time after treatment they call it the treatment gap, is one of the most vulnerable times for a person, because in treatment you're so rigorously working towards recovery, and then when you get out, if you don't connect immediately into communities and services that support that and understand that, you'll just go back to what was before, and that's where relapse happens. And so we have to do more as a community. If we want better communities, if we want healthier communities, we have to be, as a community, welcoming to people who are attempting to connect in a community as a person in recovery. I'll go over these guiding principles, and these guiding principles are what we based a lot of our curriculum on. The recovery emerges from hope. A person has to have some kind of hope. That plays into when I talked about tough love earlier. Some people have to have people that care about them. They have to have people that care. They have to have some kind of hope that things can be better, that they can change their life. It's person-driven. Somebody said that in the Facebook comment a minute ago. It is individual, and it is based on the person that's in recovery rather than us. It occurs via many pathways, which we'll talk about on next Tuesday. It is holistic, meaning that it encompasses every part of a person's life. It is supported by peers and allies, so people have to have the aid of other people. The recovery movement and this recovery to practice has also changed the language with self-help programs. Self-help implies that you're doing it yourself, and so instead The recovery movement and Recovery to Practice likes the idea and the language of mutual aid programs, like we're in this together rather than I'm doing it all myself. Because no self-help program is just you doing the work by yourself. It's all built on people that have traveled the same road helping you do that work. It's supported through relationships, social networks, so educating family members, educating community members about what addiction is and what recovery is important, so people don't have to travel the road on their own. It's culturally based and it's culturally influenced, so a person that's from one culture can't just go down the same path as a person from another. There's so many differences in who we are as people, where we were raised, what our cultures are, things that we need to be concerned about, think about a person's culture. So there is no cookie cutter here. We have to think about all of it. That we have to start addressing trauma. Treatment professionals for a long time would identify that a person had trauma and have the idea that once you're in recovery, you can get into therapy and work on that. But oftentimes we'll find that it's the trauma that causes the person to have a recurrence of use. That people can't always deal with the trauma without finding a way to suppress it. So we have to start acknowledging that while someone's in treatment and dealing with it while they're in treatment, rather than just referring them for something afterwards. Education is not treatment. And that it is based on individuals, family, community, that we have to have many people come around us to have a healthy life. And so we have to get those relationships at a better level before the person is out of our services, if we're the clinicians. And then finally, that it's based on respect. I think everything we've talked about today kind of says that we have to protect the rights of people that are in recovery when we're working with them as clinicians, and that as a community we need to look at those things too. A fellow who previously worked here at UNT, who's gone on to be an attorney for a state outside of Texas, talks a lot about the fact that because he was incarcerated with a drug-related charge, he is now a practicing attorney in another state, and when he went to move, when he got ready to move there, he couldn't get an apartment because of his arrest record. But he could become an attorney, and he even got secret clearance for working at the White House during the Obama administration, but he couldn't get an apartment. So there are some things we need to talk to our community about and educate our community about what, that people that are using substances, addicted to substances, in treatment for substances or in recovery aren't this big batch of mean people, bad, scary people.
One question going back to the trauma piece, do we need more trauma specialists in the recovery field?
Without a doubt, we need more trauma specialists in the recovery field and someone who thoroughly understands what trauma is. And beyond just they get what trauma is, but how to do trauma work. Some people without that knowledge can make worse trauma. Trauma work is not an easy thing to do. I do want to take a minute to say, though, we're in a really neat place. The Ross Institute, that does a lot of trauma work, is just right here at UVH. And they allow people who want to specialize in trauma or bring trauma work into their care to go, if you fill out an application, you can observe some of Dr. Ross's education work, not like his in practice work. He also has a lot of videos, a lot of well, they're not videos anymore, I guess. They'd probably be DVDs by now, or maybe they're online. But you can go through a trauma certification, books, workbooks, quizzes, tests. He's phenomenal, and he does some really, really cutting edge stuff, so check him out. And if I think of it, or if someone emails me, I'll put the link on a Blackboard page.
Do you think that trauma care will eventually be a part of programs like this because they are so interrelated?
Like educational programs? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, they're going to have to be.
Because what do you do if you're helping someone in recovery as a clinician and they present with this, huge trauma and you are not trained? you know?
I think it's going to have to be. Texas, the state of Texas wants us to be at least trauma informed, which means we know what trauma is, we know how to identify it, and we know how to put people in positions to work with people who are educated with trauma, but it's going to have to be. It's absolutely going to have to be. The lady that was here a few weeks ago, week before last, Kelly, their facility, that they focus on trauma. That they get people from all over the world that come there, from out of state, out of country, because trauma has driven their addiction for so long that they know if they don't do that trauma work, they're not going to remain in recovery. So I think we're going to start seeing facilities do more of that work. And if facilities are doing that work, that's the kind of educated clinician they're going to want to see come out of that. Joel, what do y'all do around trauma in graduate school?
Right now, there's no trauma courses. It's not addressed really.
Okay.
It's addressed in a general sense in our counseling courses, but not specifically addressed with a course.
Okay. Well, then that's something that we need to really make sure gets put into this curriculum. I mean, you do have to have some level of education and license to do work outside of the scope of addiction. But if it is related to the addiction, then we have to be educated around it, and we have to have the skills. The good news with people who are going to the LCDC is about 2 years of internship that you'll get good supervision, and you'll get people who kind of help you, guide you through that path, that journey of what do I do in this situation. And the other good thing is places like the communities of practice. I've been in the field for 25 years, and I can still turn to people and say, what do I do in a situation like this? Because I don't ever want to stop asking that question, because there's always new information, new ways, and none of us know everything.
And the Ross Institute also has a program you can actually go through to get sort of a certification that's related to trauma. It's very in-depth.
Mm-hmm. It is. I've gone through it. I haven't done the quizzes to become certified yet, sorry. But I've gone through all the literature, and it's amazing. Any other questions? I really appreciate y'all letting us do this today. I hope that you haven't remained silent if you normally talk because of this. All right, then. I'll see y'all on Tuesday.
Thank you.